Saudi Arabia, home to the world's most profitable company and the world's largest international airport. Today we're doing a deep dive into this misunderstood Middle Eastern superpower. We'll be going over their race with India to become the world's fastest growing economy in 2023, their potential memberships in BRICS and the SCO. We'll be covering the Vision 2030 plan, their natural resources with oil, some of their exports, as well as this new DataSaudi platform that's still in beta, where you can see a lot of the data when it comes to demographics and geography. So we're going to be covering all that and more in this video from really an objective point of view. Hope you enjoy. Let's get started. Before we jump into the slides, let's cover a bit of a geographical perspective here for Saudi Arabia, the top 3 cities in this very, very important country in the Middle East, being Riyadh, the capital, with about 4.2 million people. Then you have Jeddah here on the Red Sea, and Mecca being number 2 and 3. I was actually last year here in Hurghada doing some scuba diving on the Red Sea. Absolutely beautiful. Highly recommend visiting. And earlier this year in Dammam, which is the largest airport actually in the world, getting a 1-year visa. So Saudi Arabia is very, very interesting, very misunderstood. Throughout this video, I'll be breaking it down much more, but that's a bit of a perspective just specifically on the country. If we zoom out a bit, later in the video I'll be discussing this, but the Europe, Middle East, and India trade corridor is very important. It was something that was discussed at the UN General Meeting just a few days ago, actually, still going on at the time of recording this. But Netanyahu, Israel's prime minister, was discussing this as well. Basically, it's a trade route that will get goods from India into Europe and vice versa in less than 3 to 6 days than it currently is. So that'll basically be going from here in Greece, some of the main ports there. I've spent a nice amount of time in Greece. I absolutely love it. Beautiful islands. Basically, it'll go through here, right through Israel, then into Saudi Arabia, through Dammam, near Bahrain, then Qatar, and then into Mumbai in India. So basically cutting the trade routes that traditionally has been much, much slower. You know, obviously this whole area, China's New Silk Road project and the Belt and Road Initiative is really connecting Central Asia with Europe, with the Middle East, through Russia, through Mongolia and China. But it's very, very important to understand. I'll be covering that more later in this video, but that was a bit of a geographical perspective. Now let's move into the slides. And then lastly, if you stick around for the end of the video, I'll be covering DataSaudi, which is fascinating. It's still in the beta testing, but it's actually a dashboard really of data from the kingdom with live updates that goes over really, really important indicators. So economic indicators, you can look at social indicators. Demographics in Saudi is fascinating, with the majority of the population here, the bulk of the pyramid being about 30 to 34, so that working range where we see a lot of other countries having this issue where you have an inverted population pyramid. I talked about this in some previous videos when I covered the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, which I'm currently boots on the ground studying. But since I was in Saudi earlier this year getting that 1-year visa, I figured I would discuss it. And very, very important. Actually, the Crown Prince had a meeting with some guy on U.S. television recently. So very, very interesting and a bit topical, but let's hop into these slides. All right, so covering the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia throughout these slides, I'll be just really referring to it as KSA in the actual text, but I'll be going through everything you need to know. These are 2 pictures here with the Crown Prince with Xi Jinping, the president's leader of China, and then Modi of India, 2 of the really most important countries in the world when you look at population, both about 1.4 billion people, 1.4 billion. Yes, you heard me right. The U.S. is only 300 million, about that. Both of these countries, actually, India recently just surpassed China for their the highest population in the world. They have much better demographic outlook than China does, but that's for another video. All right, let's go. So this is very, very interesting. India versus Saudi Arabia as the fastest growing economy in 2023. India had the best outlook at the beginning of this year, saw a very, very large jump in rates. So interest rates went up to about 5%. And this really pushed India down a bit, whereas it popped Saudi Arabia up, because as you pop that up, the interest rates, typically what happens is inflation rises. And with that, obviously you have commodity assets rising. So oil is obviously a very, very important asset for Saudi Arabia when it comes to trade. So India's growth has been hurt by monetary policy tightening, high inflation, the war in Ukraine, as I stated. So the war in Ukraine, especially here, since India is really a close ally of the United States, also in with BRICS, so Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, which I'll get to later in this video. Saudi Arabia is potentially joining the SCO, so the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which is a very important alliance, and then also BRICS, which I just discussed, which is more of a trade pact that they're also looking at. There's a lot of talk of de-dollarization, but they're looking at potentially creating some sort of medium of exchange, you could call it, currency that would be, potentially a peg of all the currencies put together, or commodity basket. But India is the world's third largest economy based on PPP, so not GDP. PPP is a much better way of looking at it, and they have a bit more of a diversified economy than Saudi Arabia. But throughout this video, I'll be discussing a bit more on the Saudi 2030 vision plan, which is really, really interesting if you visit the country. Obviously, Saudi Aramco is very, very important. All over the Dammam airport, you'll see, what does it say? It's where energy is opportunity. Saudi Arabia, where energy meets opportunity, which I love that slogan. The point of this video, again, as I said in the beginning with the intro, I'm going to try and be as objective as possible. I'm not getting into really the social issues, but rather not Saudi Arabia's past necessarily, not even their presence, but really where they're moving forward over the next decade, past 2030 even. The Crown Prince is only 38 years old, so he has a very long-term vision, and very, very interesting country, kind of almost like China was in the 80s and 90s, where it really started to kind of begin the boom cycle. So let's move on here. Kingdom of Saudi Arabia is on track to become the world's fastest growing economy in 2023. GDP, so gross domestic product, obviously different measurements than PPP, has been rising due to higher energy prices. So like to talk about in the beginning, when you raise the interest rates, typically you'll see some sort of asset inflation rise with that. And a few other things, obviously, with kind of deglobalization, the world tightening with the whole Russia-Ukraine situation, that's caused some other side effects as well. So it's the world's second largest oil producer and exporter. Economic, which second to number one being the United States, the second to the oil reserves, Venezuela technically has the highest, but Saudi is below that. And then the economic transformation plan, Vision 2030, aims to reduce the reliance on oil and create a more diversified economy. So really pushing in tourism, bringing in a lot of things with sports. So they've been focusing a lot on football, or as they call it in the US, soccer. And then heavy foreign direct investment focused on non-oil sectors. Like I said, tourism, manufacturing, technology, and then the really logistics sector with this Europe, Middle East, and India trade corridor, which I touched a bit on in the beginning of the video, but I'll be touching more on because they actually recently set up an investment office in India. And then strict societal laws are gradually being relaxed. Along with that, this is something that's obviously been a concern with most people, especially in the West, with their vision of Saudi Arabia. Again, a very misunderstood country. All right, so BRICS, so Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization membership. So the SEO is actually very, very interesting. Not a lot of people know about this. They do know a lot about BRICS. A lot of this gets pushed in the news, but there's a bunch of countries that want to join BRICS. Actually, I have a full list here of countries that want to join. So Algeria, Argentina, Bahrain, Egypt, Indonesia, Iran, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Afghanistan, Bangladesh, Belarus, Kazakhstan, Mexico, Nicaragua, Nigeria, and you can read the rest. But it's very, very interesting. They were invited to this 15th BRICS summit and potentially there'll be a member beginning in January 1st, 2024. So next year, if they are not able to join G7, they had some issues with joining G7 because some of the member countries have some rules and regulations, some bureaucracy around them joining. But I think a lot of that has to do with the social aspects. And the whole point of this 2030 vision is slowly they're going to change and kind of gradually pull back some of the laws that have been, a bit traditional in Saudi Arabia, if you will. And membership will aid the kingdom with diversifying non-oil exports, all part of that Vision 2030 plan, drive investments into renewable energy, increase tourism, and access new technologies of the member countries. So a bit of a perspective here on the SEO, very, very interesting. So originally it was the Shanghai Five. So it was Russia, China, Kazakhstan, Tajikistan. It was China, Russia, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Tajikistan. Then Uzbekistan joined a little bit after, India, Pakistan following, and now potentially Saudi Arabia. It's very, very interesting. The dialogue members, Mongolia in there, really Central Asia focused, more on it's a security alliance, so not as much as a military alliance as NATO would be, but a lot of people kind of see it as the balancing force of that. Really, it's not. That's how it's branded. Typically in the U.S. But so the observer states, Afghanistan, Belarus, Iran, Mongolia, and then dialogue partners being Armenia, Azerbaijan, Cambodia. I just made a video on Cambodia previously. I spent a month there. I would highly recommend you go watch that video. Nepal, Sri Lanka, Turkey, and then the guest attendees, the ASEAN nations, which I also made a video on that, the 10 nations in Southeast Asia, Turkmenistan, UN, and then the CIS. So Kingdom of Saudi Arabia technically joined as a dialogue partner, so meaning that they'll go to some of the meetings, have certain discussions with trilateral agreements, typically between Russia, China, and Mongolia. There's a lot of trilateral agreements going on there, and then multilateral agreements with all the member countries and some of the other dialogue partners. And obviously it was founded in 2001. Like I said, previously it was called the Shanghai Five, and then their membership trails growing ties with China, which has become their largest trading partner. And then they're seeking to diversify their alliance to reduce its reliance on the United States as part of the Vision 2030 plan. Like I talked about just a few minutes ago, internationally, the SCO, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, is really viewed as a balancing force to NATO. But in reality, it's actually not. It's actually more anti-terrorism in their own domestic countries. They're not as focused on kind of interventionist foreign policy as some of these other alliances are. I won't name names. Okay, so the Eurasian Pivot is very, very interesting. So this is actually the president of Syria that was sent out of the Arab League about 12 years ago, and now he's actually joining back into the Arab League, which is basically the alliance of Arab nations in the Middle East. So very, very interesting there. Just a bit of a historical background. So since the 70s, in 73, we had the petrodollar agreements between Nixon and Saudi Arabia, basically saying that oil trade will be done in US dollar. This has kind of been broken recently. I've done videos on this in the past, but maybe I'll save that for another video to talk about a bit more. If you want anything on that, just let me know in the comments. Happy to talk about that. But they've basically been a really, really important ally of the United States as a main oil exporting country with Nixon since the 70s. Now, I would say that relationship has definitely been on the decline, especially with what's going on in Yemen, some of the issues with the Middle East in the past, Palestine-Israel situation, which ideally all these things are getting better. They're even forming more ties with Iran, which we'll get to here in a second. But on October 2022, the kingdom actually partnered with OPEC+. They partnered with Russia to cut oil production, breaking the commitments made with Joe Biden, the current U.S. president, during the July visit to Jeddah. So very, very interesting, actually. This is something where OPEC Plus members typically work together because they control a lot of the oil trade internationally. And when they decide to cut supply, obviously that raises prices. And since there's a consistent demand for oil, especially internationally, that was a very, very interesting move that kind of has shown that they're not purely reliant on the U.S. They're also diversifying their international strategy. So December 2022, the kingdom hosted the first China Gulf Cooperation Council Summit. So that really solidified their ties with China and kind of ties with Russia. And then March 2023 of this year, Iran and the kingdom agreed to restore bilateral relations in Beijing. So they actually went to Beijing together in China, had this kind of come together again, reunion, which is actually very, very good to see. It's always good to see peace in these countries, a very, very troubled history. I'm not going to get too deep on the history here, but there's a bunch of things you can go and watch, really interesting documentaries. If you want to see, kind of these endless border wars in the Middle East, why it's really stems back to ancient history. Very, very interesting. But following the agreements for the first time in 25 years, the king sent an invitation to the Iranian president to visit Riyadh, the capital of Saudi Arabia. Pretty cool. And then reiterating here, Assad, the Syrian president, arrived in Jeddah for the formal return of the Arab League after a 12-year suspension. So very, very interesting there. All right, so we'll cover these last two slides, and then we'll kind of wrap it up here with geography. But virtually, I'm not going to cover this too much just because it's gone a bit longer than I was planning, and I still want to talk about DataSaudi. But foreign property ownership, this is super important. They really had to diversify because they only had domestic demands, obviously, for real estate because it was only legal through just personal investments. It's different if you set up a business there. That's kind of a whole other subject. If you want help with that, so you can contact us at investglobal.io. But basically, the whole issue with Saudi Arabia, the real estate, is they only had domestic demand, so only people in the country could really invest in it directly. But really, really booming country, so they've recently opened this up. A quote here from the general authority, the real estate general authority. He basically said, "We have monitored the negative effects of foreign property ownership in order to avoid them and find solutions for problems and unacceptable practices." So typically in especially South Asia, foreign property ownership is very, very challenging. Japan kind of being this exception, and some parts of South Korea, but not the easiest place in the world to invest in property as a foreigner, especially if you're buying it not through business, through personal. Whereas now Saudi Arabia is opening up to this, and they currently have projects actually worth 1.1 trillion that are part of the 2030 vision plan. They're building 4 million residential units across the kingdom by 2030. They have this whole line project, which is a bit controversial, kind of a weird type of city that's in a line in the deserts. But supposedly, this is what they've talked about. It's not necessarily 100% official yet, But real estate purchase, including residential, commercial, and agricultural properties, are said to be allowed once the whole thing is finalized. And basically, this is a new system for foreign property ownership in Saudi Arabia. But a lot of diplomats, pilots that are hired by the kingdom, typically through Saudi Aramco, live there. I know a lot of people that actually grew up there in like compounds in Saudi Arabia. It's a pretty nice place to grow up. But if you're diplomats, people like that, typically you'll rent a place, and potentially it can lead to other things within the kingdom if you have closer ties. But this is more formalizing things, if you will. All right, moving on. So this is what I was talking about in the beginning of the video, the India, Middle East, and Europe corridor. So as I talked about here on Google Earth from the geographical perspective, it'll connect Greece with Israel into Riyadh, basically through Saudi Arabia into the UAE, and then into India through Mumbai. And that's just the proposed corridor. It could be some differences with some other stops along the way, with Bahrain. So the kingdom is preparing for an investment office in India. The investment minister said that I will commit today that we will open an office in India for investment facilitation. So as I talked about in the beginning of the slides, this is very interesting because they're the two countries that are competing the most for growth. Obviously, India has a much largest population in the world, still extremely emerging. I would even say, especially some parts of India, extremely frontier markets. So not a lot of developments, if you will, still a lot of room for growth. And a lot of issues as well internally in India, as well as a lot of the Middle East here. But West Asia is fascinating to me. Central Asia is fascinating to me with Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan. This whole area of the world to me is really, really interesting. So that's why I like doing boots on the ground research here. Very interesting, this trend with Saudi Arabia diversifying. Even Bridgewater, Ray Dalio's business, set up an office in Saudi Arabia, and then Saudi Arabia is now diversifying into India. So it's interesting to see these trends here. But let's see. So the office will carry out approved investments between the kingdom and India. The new India, Middle East, Europe trade corridor will link the Indian subcontinent to Europe through the Middle East, and then India's exports to Saudi Arabia surpassed 10.7 billion in 2022. The investment minister, there's a quote from him saying, "This engagement has been ongoing for thousands of years, but certainly in recent times, there has been an accelerated engagement between our two countries." Beautiful. All right. So geography last year, and then I think that's about it. Yeah, and then I'll kind of touch on DataSaudi, and then if you have any questions, just let me know down below. If you want to get in contact with us specifically, you can either send an email to contacts@investglobal.io or just visit the website. Subscribe to the channel, obviously. But so let's get into it. So a little bit here, more into geography than in the beginning. I didn't want to put this in the beginning because I know it may bore some people, but I find demographics and geography to be incredibly important. As Napoleon said, to know a nation's geography is to know its foreign policy. So very, very important here with Saudi Arabia. So they're the fifth largest country in Asia, the largest country in West Asia, typically in the West, US, Canada, Australia. We call this, the Middle East, but really it's West Asia if you really want to look at it geographically. And the kingdom covers 2 million kilometers squared and home to Rub al Khali, which I'm definitely butchering the name, the largest sand desert on Earth. So that's very interesting. The climate, so desert climate, hot summers and midwinters. The summer temperatures can reach around 50 degrees Celsius in the summer. In the winter, temperatures can actually drop to freezing, and then rainfall is very scarce in many regions. And this mostly occurs in the western and southern regions of the country. Natural resources, obviously very, very rich in oil reserves, nat gas, gold, and copper. And then the world's largest exporter of oil, there's some debate on that. And then it has the second largest proven oil reserves, second to Venezuela. The oil industry plays a key role in the domestic economy and has led to the rapid development of the past few decades. So lastly here, wrapping it up with DataSaudi. Again, I applaud them for doing this. I think all countries should really do this because some of these third-party sites that have been around for the past 5-10 years are really, really outdated. And I think having the numbers domestically, especially with a lot of things going digital, switching from analog operations into digital when it comes to identification, whether you like that trend or not, is kind of not the point, but that's the reality. That's where the trajectory is going. So having all the data being shown here, open source, I really, really like. So you have social indicators. They have it set up very, very well. It's still in beta, so you can actually go by each. Each region in the country, which is really interesting here. That's at the very top. You can kind of double click onto all these to see where they're building the most, where the money's flowing. You can look at the inflation rate. So domestic inflation is 2%. Fourth quarter GDP. You can look at the unemployment rate, which is about 8.5%. Total population 32 million. You can go through all the economic indicators. Really interesting. Again, I really applaud them on this. I'll have a link for it down below, but it's datasaudi.mep.gov.sa. So that's basically all for the video. If you have any questions, please let me know down below in the comments. Let me know if there's anything you'd like me to cover in another video. But like I said, if you want to get in touch with us, you can visit investglobal.io. That's all for this video. Thank you very much for watching. Thank you for your time and your attention. And until next time.